The ex-wife of the biggest drunkard in baseball history sat down with police and tried to take the blame. She told them she was the one making those calls, not him, her. That moment alone tells you everything you need to know about the horrible truth of Albert Belle. He was one of the most feared hitters this game has ever seen. He had numbers that would make any Hall of Fame voter stop and stare. And yet, by the time it was all over, the people who were supposed to love him most were willing to go to jail to keep his secrets safe. That is where this story ends up. But to understand how it got there, you need to see the full picture. Quick thing before we go any further. If this kind of real talk is what you came for, tap that hype feature right now and give this video some hype. It helps more than you know. Now back to Albert Belle. It was March of 2018. Albert Belle was 51 years old. He had not played professional baseball in nearly 2 decades. His career was behind him. His records were in the books. And there he was, standing in a parking lot at the Phoenix Rising soccer complex in Arizona, doing something no former All-Star should ever be doing in broad daylight. A man walking through that parking lot with his 5-year-old daughter saw Belle urinating out in the open, not tucked away, not hidden, right there in plain sight where anyone could see. The man yelled at him to stop, and Albert Belle, a man who had once stood in front of sold-out stadiums and made grown pitchers nervous, turned around and made an obscene gesture at that man and his little girl. A 5-year-old child was standing right there watching. Police arrived and found him exactly the way you would expect. Bloodshot eyes, the strong smell of alcohol coming off him. He was behind the wheel of a car. He was charged with 2 counts of indecent exposure, including 1 count specifically listing a child under the age of 15 as a victim. He was also hit with 2 counts of driving under the influence, including extreme DUI, which means his blood alcohol content was significantly above what the law allows. The charges were eventually dismissed, but the image does not go away just because a court drops the paperwork. A man and his daughter saw what they saw, and what they saw was the end result of a life that had never truly been corrected. This was not a one-night collapse. This was not a man who had lived clean for decades and then slipped up at the worst possible moment. This was a man with a pattern, a long, documented, well-witnessed pattern of rage, alcohol, violence, deception, and intimidation that ran straight through his entire adult life. A pattern that started before he was even well known and kept going long after the cameras stopped watching. And at almost every single point in that pattern, someone stepped in to protect him, cover for him, deflect for him, or take the punishment that was supposed to land on him. The enabling was as constant as the behavior itself. So how does a man with that much raw talent end up in a parking lot in Phoenix, charged with exposing himself to a child? That is the question. And to answer it, you have to go all the way back to the beginning. Albert Belle grew up in Shreveport, Louisiana, and he was a baseball talent almost from the moment he picked up a bat. His swing generated power that scouts noticed immediately. His ability to drive the ball, to turn on inside pitches, to hit for both average and distance, was the kind of rare combination that organizations spend years searching for. When the Cleveland Indians got him into their system, they knew what they had. This was a franchise cornerstone, a future face of the team, a player who could carry a lineup for years if everything went right. And on the field, for stretches of time, he was everything they hoped for. When he was locked in, there were few hitters in the game who could match him. He brought a menace to the batter's box that was difficult to explain if you had never seen it in person. Pitchers did not want to face him. Managers did not want to plan for him. He was a genuine force. That part of the Albert Belle story is real, and it deserves to be said out loud before anything else. Because what comes next only matters as much as it does because of how good he actually was. The numbers back that up in a way that is hard to argue with. In his peak years, he was averaging 37 home runs per season. He drove in at least 100 runs in 9 straight seasons. 9. That kind of consistency is almost impossible to sustain at the major league level. The pitchers he faced were the best in the world, and he handled them year after year with a relentlessness that his managers loved and his opponents feared. When the 1995 season was over and the final stat lines were printed, he had done something no player in the history of the sport had ever done. 50 home runs and 50 doubles in the same season. A combination that requires both raw power and the kind of consistent hard contact that most power hitters never develop. It remains a record that no one has touched. not before him, and not after him. It still stands alone. And when you understand the full scope of what he was capable of when he was right, it makes everything that surrounded it hurt even more. Because the talent was real, the waste was real too. But even in those early days, before the fame and the massive contracts, there were signs that something underneath was deeply wrong. Not just competitive intensity, not just a fierce desire to win, something darker, something that the people around him were already trying to manage rather than fix. In 1990, things finally broke open. Belle was struggling badly at the major league level. He was hitting only .174 in his first 9 games of the season. The organization sent him down to the AAA affiliate in Colorado Springs to work things out. And in Colorado Springs, away from the spotlight, away from the protection of a major league roster, he destroyed a bathroom sink. He did not bump it. He did not crack it. He smashed it to pieces in a fit of rage that left the room looking like something had exploded inside it. That incident forced the Cleveland organization to look harder at what was actually going on. And what they found was not just a temper problem. Reports from people inside the organization at that time described him as a serious abuser of alcohol, a closet drinker, someone who had built a dependency that was already out of control before he had even established himself at the highest level of the sport. The Indians responded by mandating a 10-week rehabilitation program at the Cleveland Clinic. The goal was straightforward: get the drinking under control, stabilize the behavior, protect the investment, and send him back out there. And when he completed the program and came back, he made a gesture that was meant to signal a new beginning. He asked to stop being called Joey. He wanted to be Albert. A different name, a different chapter. A symbolic reset that would announce to everyone paying attention that the old version was gone and a better one had taken his place. It did not work. Within a year, the truth was already visible again. In 1991, during his first full season as Albert Belle, he was playing in a game when a fan in the stands started heckling him. The fan was mocking him about his time in rehabilitation. Reports say the fan invited him to a keg party after the game. It was a mean-spirited jab designed to get under his skin. Fans say things like that. It happens to players all the time. The ones who have done the real internal work absorb it, shake their heads, and focus on the next pitch. The ones who have only changed their name respond differently. Albert Belle picked up a baseball and threw it hard and directly into the chest of that fan. A professional throw, aimed, intentional. The man in the stands had done nothing illegal. He had said something rude, and he received a baseball to the chest for it. Belle was suspended for 6 games. 6 games for what was, without any softening of language, a physical assault on a spectator. The new name had changed nothing. The anger was identical. The impulse control had not improved. And the consequences had been minimized by an organization that was already invested in keeping its best hitter on the field. What happened next is important to understand in context. That suspension did not quiet the league's concerns about him. It amplified them. Other teams were already watching. Reporters were already taking notes. The Whisper Network inside baseball, the scouts and coaches and writers who traded information across city lines, had already started to build a file on Albert Belle that went beyond batting averages and exit velocity. The file was about what he was like to be around, what he was like when things went wrong, what he was like when someone pushed back at him, even slightly, even from a safe distance in the bleachers. The answer was always the same. He escalated. Every single time, he escalated. And the people running the Cleveland franchise knew that file existed. They chose to keep running him out to left field every afternoon anyway, because the damage he did in a batter's box was worth more to them in that moment than the damage he did everywhere else. By 1994, Albert Belle had become one of the most dangerous hitters in all of baseball. His numbers were reaching historic territory. His presence in the Cleveland lineup was something the rest of the American League feared. But even at the height of his dominance, he was cheating. And when that cheating was about to be exposed, the organization around him chose to protect him in a way that sounds more like a heist movie than a baseball story. On July 15th, 1994, the Indians were playing the Chicago White Sox at Comiskey Park. Both teams were fighting hard for the American League Central crown. The White Sox manager, Gene Lamont, had received a tip that Belle was using a corked bat. Corking a bat is illegal in baseball. You hollow out the barrel, fill it with cork, and the lighter weight gives you faster swing speed and an unfair advantage over every pitcher you face. In the first inning, Lamont challenged the bat. Home plate umpire Dave Phillips confiscated it and locked it inside the umpire's dressing room, where it would sit until it could be properly inspected after the game. The Cleveland clubhouse immediately understood the problem. The bat was indeed illegal. When it got inspected, a 10-day suspension was the minimum Belle was looking at. So someone in that clubhouse made a decision. A pitcher named Jason Grimsley Grimsley was chosen for the job, and the job was to break into the umpire's room and swap the bat before it could be inspected. Grimsley entered through the ceiling tiles in the manager's office. He had a flashlight in his mouth because he needed both hands free. He crawled through the ductwork above the stadium in the dark, squeezing through tight spaces, moving across metal brackets that were not designed to hold a person's weight. At one point, during the crawl, he nearly fell through the ceiling directly into a groundskeeper's room below him. He kept moving. He found his way above the umpire's dressing room, dropped down into it, grabbed Belle's corked bat, and left a replacement bat in its place. The problem was the replacement bat. It had the name Paul Sorrento written on it. Paul Sorrento was a teammate, not Albert Belle. The umpires noticed the name on the bat immediately. They also looked around the room and noticed ceiling dust scattered across the floor, ceiling tiles disturbed and askew, and metal brackets twisted out of shape. Someone had been inside that room through the ceiling. A police investigation was opened on the spot. Commissioner Bud Selig was furious. He threatened to bring in the FBI to prosecute the break-in as an actual criminal burglary unless the original bat was returned. The Cleveland organization eventually handed it over. It was x-rayed and then cut in half, right in front of the Indians' general manager and Belle himself standing there watching. The cork was right inside the barrel, exactly where the tip said it would be. The suspension was eventually reduced to 7 games, but what came out years later made the whole episode even more significant. Teammate Omar Vizquel wrote in his 2002 autobiography that essentially all of Belle's bats were corked. Every single one. That is why Grimsley had to substitute a Sorrento bat during the swap. There was not a single clean Belle bat available to use as the replacement. The cheating was not occasional, it was systematic. And critically, the manager reportedly gave the thumbs up to the ceiling crawl plan. The bench coach was reportedly aware. This was not a lone act by one desperate player. This was an organization making a collective decision to commit what amounted to criminal trespass in order to shield their best hitter from the consequences of his own illegal behavior. The enabling was not just personal, it was institutional. It was baked into the structure of the team itself. The reaction from around baseball to that entire episode was telling. Other players knew what it meant. Other managers knew what it meant. When a franchise sends a pitcher crawling through a ceiling to protect a star, it sends a message to every person inside that sport about where the lines actually are. Not where the rulebook says they are, where they actually are in practice. And the message was clear. If you are good enough, the rules bend for you. If you are great enough, the people around you will risk their own reputations and potentially their own freedom to make sure the rules never quite reach you. That message does not stay inside one clubhouse. It travels, and it creates a standard, even if no one ever says it out loud, that elite talent earns a different kind of treatment than everyone else. 1 year after the corked bat scandal, on Halloween night in 1995, Albert Belle demonstrated how that pattern of unchecked behavior had grown into something more physically dangerous. A group of teenagers egged his house in Cleveland. It was juvenile. It was rude. It was the kind of prank that has happened in neighborhoods across the country on Halloween night for as long as kids have existed. Most adults in that situation maybe call the police. Maybe they step outside and say something to the kids. Then they go back in, clean up the mess, and go on with their night. Albert Belle got into his SUV and chased them. He pursued those teenagers through the neighborhood in his vehicle, tracking them down the way a hunter tracks prey. He eventually caught up to them on a nearby property and allegedly used his car to bump one of the teenagers. A person with a vehicle. He was charged with reckless operation of a vehicle and fined. A civil lawsuit was filed against him in early 1996, and he eventually settled that lawsuit in October of 1997. No mention was ever made of it affecting his status on the team. What makes this incident so important for understanding what comes later is the escalation it represents. Before this, the violence was immediate and impulsive. Throwing a baseball, smashing a sink, hitting a player on the field. But the Halloween chase required movement. It required tracking someone down. It required using a vehicle not as transportation, but as a tool of pursuit and intimidation. That specific combination, the tracking and the use of technology or machinery to close the distance between himself and someone he wanted to confront, would reappear in a much darker form in 2006. The seed was planted on that Halloween night. On May 31st, 1996, Albert Belle gave everyone in baseball a moment they would not forget. Playing against the Milwaukee Brewers, Belle was on the base paths, trying to break up a double play at second base. Breaking up a double play is a legal part of the game. Runners are expected to slide hard and disrupt the fielder's throw to first base. But Albert Belle did not slide. He delivered a forearm shiver to second baseman Fernando Vina that witnesses and observers described as one of the most violent plays they had ever seen on a Major League Baseball field. The hit was not incidental. It was not a momentum issue. It was targeted. It was a deliberate strike to Vina's chest and face with full force. American League President Gene Budig suspended Belle for 2 games and fined him $25,000. Both punishments were considered extremely light by people who watched the play. And Albert Belle's response to those punishments, to the fine and the suspension for what he had done, was 4 words. He said, "I apologize for nothing." Those 4 words captured something essential about who he was. Not frustration, not defensiveness, complete rejection of the idea that anything he had done required any kind of acknowledgement or regret. He did not see a problem. He did not feel responsible. He was not going to pretend otherwise. Baseball writers started reaching for alarming language when they described him during this period. Words like nuts, phrases like perpetual caffeinated frenzy. The sport itself seemed uncertain about how to hold him accountable in a meaningful way. The penalties were always smaller than the behavior, and the behavior kept growing. By 2001, the physical toll of years of high-intensity play had caught up with his body. Albert Belle was 34 years old and playing for the Baltimore Orioles. He had signed a 5-year, $65 million contract with the team in 1999, one of the biggest deals in baseball at that time. But the wear on his hip had reached a point of no return. He was diagnosed with degenerative osteoarthritis. The condition was so severe and so advanced that it ended his career entirely. He was declared totally disabled. Not just injured, totally disabled. That designation was not only medical. It had serious financial consequences for the organization. Because Belle was declared totally disabled, the Orioles were able to activate a massive insurance policy on his contract and recover somewhere between $27 million and $35 million. But the arrangement required that Belle remain on the disabled list as a technical employee of the team for the full duration of his contract. If he had officially retired, the insurance policy would have been voided. The Orioles would have been responsible for the full $65 million with no recovery mechanism. So, Albert Belle was kept on the books. He was paid. He existed in the Orioles organization as a financial line item, but he was completely absent. He did not show up to the facility. He did not interact with the team. He was physically nowhere near the club. He was there only on paper, only in the accounting records, only because the insurance contract required it. The organization and the player used the system together, each for their own financial benefit, and the result was a ghost on the roster. When that arrangement finally ended, there was no baseball left to absorb his behavior, no clubhouse culture to wrap around him, no manager to run interference, no team to benefit from keeping him protected. For the first time in his adult life, Albert Belle was just a private citizen with the same problems he had always had, and far fewer structures standing between those problems and the outside world. That is when the most disturbing chapter of his life began. In February of 2006, Albert Belle was arrested in Scottsdale, Arizona. The charge was stalking, not an impulsive outburst, not a bar fight, not a rage moment that lasted seconds and then was over. Stalking, calculated, sustained, and technologically sophisticated harassment of a woman who had been involved with him. The investigation opened on January 26, 2006, when the victim found a GPS tracking device that had fallen off the undercarriage of her vehicle. She had no idea the device was there. She had no idea she had been monitored. But the device told the story. For months, according to what she reported to police, Belle had been showing up everywhere she went. The grocery store, the gym, even when she was out on dates with other men. He always knew where she was because he had placed a tracking device on her car without her knowledge and had been watching her movements for an extended period of time. Initially, Belle denied everything. He said he had nothing to do with the device. But then he left a voicemail. On February 3rd, 2006, he called her and left a message in which he apologized for, essentially in his own words, doing all that tracking stuff. He said it himself on a recorded message. He admitted to placing the device and monitoring her whereabouts. And then, rather than stepping back and recognizing the severity of what he had done, he escalated immediately. He followed that apology voicemail with threatening messages directed at the same woman. He told her she needed to hire a bodyguard. He told her she would never know what hit her. Read that sequence again slowly. He apologized for tracking her location without her consent And then, in the same week, he threatened her life. His bail was set at $108,000. He was placed on court-ordered electronic monitoring using a GPS ankle bracelet. Albert Belle, who had secretly placed a GPS device on a woman's vehicle to surveil her every movement, was now being tracked by a GPS device on his own ankle, placed there by a court of law. He eventually pleaded guilty to reduced stalking charges and was sentenced to 90 days in jail and 5 years of supervised probation. And now comes the detail that earns this video its title, the part that the research calls the horrible truth, the part that the ex-wife reveals. At the time of the stalking case, Albert Belle was married, and according to contemporary reports from that period, his wife, the woman he was legally married to while all of this was happening, actually approached authorities and attempted to take legal responsibility for the harassing phone calls that Belle had made to the victim. She told them she was the one who had made those calls. Not him, her. She tried to put herself between him and the prosecution. Take a moment and think about what that means in full. His wife knew that her husband had been secretly monitoring another woman for months. She knew about the phone calls, she knew about the obsession, and her response was not to contact law enforcement. Her response was not to leave. Her response was to walk into the legal process and try to absorb the criminal liability herself in order to protect him from facing the full consequences of what he had done to someone else. She was willing to potentially expose herself to criminal charges, including possible perjury, in order to keep Albert Belle shielded. That is the horrible truth. That is the world he had built around himself. The wife who tried to take the blame, the manager who approved the ceiling crawl, the organization that handed back a corked bat to avoid FBI involvement, the institution that kept him on the payroll as a ghost employee to collect an insurance payout. He did not just escape accountability because he was talented. He escaped accountability because an entire ecosystem of people had been built up around him over decades, and every person in that ecosystem had been trained, whether consciously or not, to absorb consequences on his behalf rather than let them reach him. When that ecosystem was fully stripped away, when the career was over and the contracts were done, and the people who had enabled him for 30 years were no longer positioned to intercept the fallout, the behavior continued. It had never been corrected. It had only been managed and concealed. The years between 2006 and 2018 were quiet on the surface. No headlines, no arrests that made national news, no incidents that forced another round of columns about Albert Belle and what he represented. From the outside, it looks like a man who had finally settled into a private life and left the chaos behind him. He had served his time. He had completed his probation. He had disappeared from the public conversation in a way that made it easy to assume the worst was behind him. But quiet years are not the same as fixed years. They are not the same as healed years. Underneath the quiet surface, the same conditions that had produced every incident from 1990 onward were still present. The alcohol, the anger, the absence of any real accountability structure. None of that had been addressed in any lasting way. The probation ended, the monitoring ended, and with nothing left to check his behavior, the clock simply kept running until the next incident found its moment. Which brings us back to Phoenix, March 2018, a parking lot, a man and his little girl. A 51-year-old former All-Star who had been given more chances than most people receive in multiple lifetimes, standing there drunk, facing indecent exposure and extreme DUI charges, with a 5-year-old child as one of the named victims. The charges were dismissed, but the story was written. 30 years after a sink was smashed in Colorado Springs, the same man was standing in a parking lot in Arizona, and nothing essential had ever changed. When Albert Belle appeared on the Hall of Fame ballot for the first time in 2006, the statistical case for his inclusion was genuinely strong. 381 career home runs, 1,239 runs batted in, 9 consecutive seasons with at least 100 RBIs, 5 Silver Slugger Awards. And in 1995, he became the only player in the history of the sport to hit 50 home runs and 50 doubles in the same season. That has never been done before or since. By the numbers, he belonged in Cooperstown. He received 7.7% of the vote. You need 75% to gain entry. The following year, the number dropped to 3.5%, and he was removed from the ballot completely. Veteran writers were direct. They cited his behavior. They cited the Fernando Vina hit. They cited the stalking charges. They said he had been no credit to the game. The character clause, which gives voters the right to consider integrity and conduct alongside statistics, existed for exactly this kind of case, and the writers used it without hesitation. Belle's public defense was that the rejection was racially motivated, that the media had always been biased against him because he was, in his own words, just an angry black man, that his personality, not his actions, had been used as the justification. But the record does not support that argument. The record shows a GPS tracker placed on a woman's car without her consent. The record shows a vehicle used to pursue and bump a teenager on Halloween night. The record shows a baseball thrown at a fan's chest because the fan mentioned a keg party. The record shows a forearm shiver so violent that the president of the American League stepped in personally. The record shows cork inside bats, a pitcher crawling through stadium ductwork, and a wife sitting down with police to confess to crimes she did not commit. That is not a personality. That is a pattern, a long one, a consistent one that the Hall of Fame voters could read as clearly as any box score. The legacy of Albert Belle is not one story. It is two stories sitting side by side that never fully resolved into one. There was the hitter, one of the most dangerous and dominant offensive players of his generation, a man whose peak performance seasons still hold up against anyone in the history of the game. And then there was everything else. The alcohol, the rage, the cheating, the violence, the stalking, the enabling, the people who kept stepping in to absorb what was supposed to come back to him. And the lesson, if there is one, is not really about Albert Belle at all. It is about the systems that surrounded him. The Cleveland organization that gave the thumbs up to a ceiling crawl rather than accept a 7-game suspension. The insurance contract structure that kept a retired player on the payroll as a financial ghost rather than forcing a clean ending. The wife who tried to confess to crimes she had not committed, rather than let the law reach her husband. The culture of professional sports in the 1990s that prioritized wins and box scores over the basic accountability that every other person in that sport was expected to live by. Belle was broken in ways that needed real help. The 10 weeks at the Cleveland Clinic in 1990 was a start that never became anything more than a start. The name change was a gesture that never became a transformation. The suspensions were short enough to be absorbed without consequence. The fines were small enough to be treated as the cost of doing business. At every single stage where a real intervention could have happened, the path of least resistance was chosen instead. And the path of least resistance in that world meant protecting the asset, keeping the hitter in the lineup, and hoping the behavior would somehow manage itself over time. It never does. That is the lesson. It never manages itself. It only grows into whatever the next version of the parking lot in Phoenix looks like. The people closest to someone like this carry damage too. The wife, who tried to take his blame, did not walk out of that situation unharmed. The teammates who stayed silent about corked bats, who watched a colleague crawl through a ceiling to protect a cheater, carried something from that. The victim who found a GPS tracker on her car and then listened to a threatening voicemail from the same man who placed it there carried something far heavier. Enabling is not a neutral act. It has consequences that reach beyond the person being protected. It shapes the people who do the protecting. It tells victims that the system is not built for them. It tells everyone watching that accountability has a price tag. And if someone produces enough value, the price goes up until most people decide it is too high to pay. That is a lesson sports organizations, and honestly a lot of institutions outside of sports, still have not fully learned. Sports can do better than this. Organizations can hold players accountable in ways that do not disappear when the batting average is good enough. Teams can demand that the standards they apply to everyone else are applied equally to the people who generate the most revenue. Families and people close to athletes can be empowered to seek real help instead of being pulled into cycles of protection that ultimately hurt everyone, including themselves. Albert Belle was one of the greatest pure hitters the game has ever produced. That is not a small thing. That deserves to be said clearly and honestly. But greatness with a bat should never have been and should never be a reason to look away when someone is causing harm and suffering real damage. The talent and the behavior were always two separate things. The mistake was treating them as one. This story is a warning about what happens when systems choose wins over accountability. A warning about what a life looks like when the people meant to help you are instead trained to protect you from the consequences you need to grow. A warning about what keeps showing up year after year and decade after decade when nothing real is ever actually fixed. If you stayed with this story all the way to the end, drop a comment below and tell me what you think the turning point should have been. Was it 1990 at the Cleveland Clinic? Was it 1994 in that ceiling? Was it the Halloween chase in 1995? Let me know where you think it could have gone differently. If you have not already, make sure you like this video and hit subscribe, because there are more stories like this one on the way, and you will not want to miss them.